The wail of a hungry infant pierced the stillness of the prairie night, each desperate cry like a knife through Rose Patterson's heart. She cradled her 3-month-old daughter against her chest, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, as she gently rocked back and forth on the edge of her bed in the one-room cabin. It had been 2 days since her milk had dried up completely, the culmination of weeks of diminishing supply as her own body withered from malnutrition. "Hush now, my sweet Emma," Rose whispered, her voice cracking. "Mama's trying." The year was 1876, and the harsh Dakota Territory frontier had shown Rose no mercy since her husband's death 3 months earlier. James Patterson had been thrown from his horse while checking their meager cattle herd, his neck broken instantly upon impact with a rock. Rose had been 7 months pregnant at the time. Now, at 22, she was a widow with a hungry baby and dwindling resources. The drought had claimed their crops, illness had taken their chickens, and wolves had picked off their last 2 cows just days ago. With each passing hour, Emma's cries grew weaker, and Rose's desperation mounted. "Please, Lord," she prayed, pressing her chapped lips to her daughter's forehead. "Send us help." As if in response, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her ears. Rose stiffened, clutching Emma tighter. Visitors were rare in this remote stretch of territory, and not always welcome. Since James's death, 2 different men had come by, supposedly to check on the widow Patterson, their intentions transparent in their wandering eyes. Rose quickly laid Emma in her cradle and reached for James's shotgun, which she kept loaded by the door. With trembling hands, she pulled back the curtain from the window and peered into the golden light of dawn. A lone rider approached on a chestnut stallion, a small herd of cattle following behind. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but something in his posture conveyed purpose rather than threat. Emma's cry grew more insistent, and Rose felt torn between tending to her child and facing whatever was coming. She chose to stand her ground, shotgun raised as the rider drew closer and finally reined his horse to a stop about 20 yards from her cabin. "Hello, the house," the stranger called, his voice deep and clear in the morning air. "Permission to approach?" Rose hesitated, adjusting her grip on the shotgun. "State your business." The man removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind, though he couldn't have been much older than 30. "Name's Preston Grant, madam. I'm driving cattle to my new spread about 10 miles north. Heard a baby crying from the trail. Thought someone might be in trouble." Emma wailed again, the sound drifting through the open window, seeming to answer Preston's statement. Rose's arms began to shake from the weight of the shotgun. Pride warred with necessity in her heart. "My baby's hungry," she finally admitted, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "I've got nothing to feed her." Understanding dawned on Preston's face. Without a word, he dismounted and began rummaging through his saddlebags. He extracted a small parcel wrapped in cloth and approached slowly, hands visible. "Stay right there," Rose commanded when he was about halfway to the cabin. Preston nodded, stopping obediently. "Madam, I've got some jerky and hardtack. Not much, but it's something." And he gestured back toward his small herd. "I've got milk cows among those cattle. I could bring one up for your little one." Rose blinked in disbelief. You'd do that for strangers?" A small, sad smile touched Preston's lips. "My sister lost her baby 2 winters ago. No milk, no help for miles. I swore I'd never pass by someone in need again." The raw sincerity in his voice made Rose lower the shotgun slightly. Emma's cries had reached a fevered pitch now. "Please," Rose whispered, pride finally crumbling under the weight of her child's need. Preston nodded once, returned to his horse, and rode back to the herd. Rose watched as he separated a gentle-looking brown cow from the others and led it toward the cabin. The animal followed docilely, seeming almost to understand the urgency of the situation. "She's freshened recently," Preston called as he approached. "Lost her calf to coyotes last week. She's still got plenty of milk." He tied the cow to the hitching post near Rose's door, then stepped back respectfully. "Do you have a pail, madam?" Rose nodded, finally lowering the shotgun completely. She disappeared inside, returning moments later with a tin bucket. Emma's cries had weakened to whimpers of exhaustion. "I don't know how to milk her," Rose admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice. "My husband always handled the livestock. Before She couldn't finish. Preston's expression remained gentle. "May I?" He gestured toward the bucket. Rose handed it to him and watched as he squatted beside the cow, strong hands working with practiced efficiency. Soon, the pail contained several inches of warm milk. He stood and offered it to Rose. "You'll need to boil it and let it cool some before giving it to the little one," he advised. "And you should take some yourself, madam. You look like you could use the strength." Rose accepted the pail, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of this stranger. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Grant. Preston, please." "And no thanks needed. I'll leave the cow with you." Rose shook her head. "I can't take your livestock." "You're not taking anything. I'm offering." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I could check back in a few days. Make sure you and the little one are faring well. Maybe bring some supplies." Under normal circumstances, Rose would have refused such charity outright. But Emma's hunger outweighed all other considerations. "That would be most kind of you." Preston tipped his hat, a genuine smile warming his weathered features. "Then it's settled. I'll be moving my herd to my new place. Then I'll return in 3 days' time. Will that do?" Rose nodded, gratitude constricting her throat. "What's your name, madam, if you don't mind my asking?" "Rose Patterson. And this is Emma." She shifted the baby in her arms so Preston could see her tiny face, now red from crying. "Mrs. Patterson," Preston acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Miss Emma. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, though I wish it were under happier circumstances." He untied his horse from where he'd secured it. "The cow's name is Daisy. She's gentle as they come." He hesitated, then added, "There's a stream about 50 yards behind your property. She'll need water twice a day." Rose nodded, already calculating how she would manage these new responsibilities in her weakened state. As Preston mounted his horse, he looked down at her with an expression Rose couldn't quite read. 3 days, he promised, then tipped his hat once more before riding back to his waiting herd. Rose watched him go, the pail of milk heavy in her hands, the cow lowing softly beside her. When Preston disappeared over the rise, she hurried inside to prepare the milk for Emma. Later that evening, with Emma finally sleeping peacefully with a full belly, Rose sat on her porch step watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. Daisy grazed contentedly nearby, the cow's presence a surreal answer to desperate prayers. Rose allowed herself to think of Preston Grant, his kind eyes and capable hands, the gentle way he'd spoken. For the first time since James's death, she felt something other than grief and fear. It was too soon to name it hope, but it was something like it, a tiny flame in the darkness that had become her life. 3 days, she whispered to herself, surprised to find she was counting the hours already. True to his word, Preston Grant returned exactly 3 days later. Rose had spent the morning watching the horizon, telling herself she wasn't eager for his arrival, that she was merely anticipating the supplies he'd promised. She'd bathed both herself and Emma in water hauled from the stream, and put on her least worn dress. Practical considerations. She assured herself nothing more. When she spotted the dust cloud signaling an approaching rider, Rose busied herself hanging laundry on the line stretched between two posts in her yard. She wouldn't appear to be waiting for him like some love-struck girl. Preston rode up on his chestnut stallion, leading a pack mule laden with burlap sacks and wooden crates. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing hair that had been recently trimmed and slicked back with water. "Mrs. Patterson," he greeted, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "I see you and Miss Emma are still with us." Rose nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "Thanks to your kindness, Mr. Grant. Daisy has been a godsend." Preston dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "And how is the old girl treating you?" He patted the cow's flank as she grazed nearby. "Very well, though I fear my milking technique leaves much to be desired." Rose felt her cheeks warm at the admission. "It takes practice," Preston replied kindly. "Would you like me to show you again?" Rose nodded, grateful for the offer. They spent the next hour with Preston demonstrating the proper milking technique, his strong hands guiding hers until she felt more confident. His proximity sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, a feeling Rose immediately suppressed. She was a grieving widow with a child to raise, not a girl with time for such foolishness. "I've brought some supplies," Preston said afterward, untying the pack mule. "Flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, some dried apples, and a few other necessities." "Mr. Grant, this is too much," Rose protested, overwhelmed by the generosity. "I can't accept such charity." Preston's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Patterson, out here, helping neighbors isn't charity, it's survival. One day, you may be in a position to help someone else." Rose wanted to argue but knew he was right. The Dakota Territory wasn't a place where pride kept you alive. "Then I'm grateful, truly." As they unloaded the supplies, Preston mentioned casually, "I've been meaning to ask, your land, are you working it alone?" Rose stiffened slightly. "My husband died 3 months ago, just before Emma was born." Preston's face registered genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Patterson. Truly. Thank you." Rose busied herself arranging the flour sack in her small pantry, avoiding his gaze. "I don't mean to pry," Preston continued carefully, "but do you have family nearby? Anyone to help you?" Rose shook her head. "James and I came west from Illinois 2 years ago. My parents passed when I was 16. His family didn't approve of me." She didn't elaborate on how James's wealthy Boston family had disowned him for marrying a farmer's daughter. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's a hard country for anyone alone, especially a woman with a child. Rose straightened, a flash of defensiveness rising. "We'll manage. I've no doubt of that, Mrs. Patterson. I can see you're a woman of considerable determination." There was respect in his voice, not pity. "But perhaps we might help each other." Rose raised an eyebrow, instantly wary. "How so?" "I've just purchased land to the north, good grazing land for my cattle. But I'm no farmer, and I need vegetables come winter." Preston leaned against her kitchen table, his manner casual but his eyes intent. "I thought perhaps we might arrange a trade. I can provide milk, meat, protection when needed. You could grow extra in your garden to share." Rose considered the offer. It made practical sense, and Preston had already proven himself trustworthy. Still, she hesitated. "That's generous, Mr. Grant. But, Preston, please." "Preston." She tested the name, finding she liked the sound of it. "I'm Rose." She took a breath and continued. "The drought has made farming difficult. I can't guarantee a successful harvest. Then we'll both take the risk." Preston smiled, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made Rose's heart skip. "And in the meantime, I could help with some repairs around your place." That roof looks like it could use attention before the winter storms. Rose glanced up instinctively. The cabin's roof had indeed begun to leak in several places. James had planned to replace some of the shingles before his accident. "Why would you do all this for strangers?" she asked finally, voicing the question that had haunted her since his first appearance. Preston's smile faded, replaced by something more complex. "As I said, out here we help each other." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And perhaps I understand what it means to be alone in this country." There was a story there, Rose sensed, but before she could respond, Emma began to cry from her cradle in the corner. Rose moved to pick her up, checking her diaper and finding it dry. "Hungry again," she murmured, rocking the fussing infant. "I should go," Preston said, reaching for his hat. "Let you tend to your daughter in peace." Rose nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "When will you? That is, if you still want to trade, when should we begin the arrangement?" Preston paused at the door. "I need to finish getting my herd settled and my cabin in order. Would it be agreeable if I returned in a week's time? Perhaps I could bring materials for your roof then." "That would be fine," Rose replied, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the warmth spreading through her chest. Preston settled his hat on his head and stepped outside. "A week then, Rose Patterson." The way he said her name lingered in the air long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance. The week passed more quickly than Rose expected, filled with the routines of caring for Emma, tending her struggling garden, and milking Daisy. The cow's rich milk had already begun to restore Rose's strength, and Emma was thriving, her cheeks filling out and her cries growing stronger. Each day, Rose found herself looking to the northern horizon more often than necessary. She told herself she was simply watching for storms, but the flutter in her stomach when she finally spotted Preston approaching on the 7th day betrayed her true anticipation. He arrived with a wagon this time, loaded with lumber, tools, and more supplies. Over the next 3 days, Preston repaired her roof, mended the sagging porch steps, and fixed the broken pump at her well, all while refusing anything more than meals in exchange for his labor. In the evenings, they sat on her porch, watching the sunset while Emma slept inside. Preston told her about his journey west from Pennsylvania after the war, his time as a trail boss driving cattle from Texas, and his dream of building a successful ranch in the territory. "What made you leave Pennsylvania?" Rose asked on the 3rd evening, curious about the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he spoke of home. Preston was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "The war changed everything," he finally said. "My father and older brother both died at Gettysburg. After that, my mother. She was never the same. When she passed 2 years later, there wasn't much left for me there." "I'm sorry," Rose said softly, understanding loss all too well. Preston shrugged. "It was a long time ago. The war ended 11 years ago this spring." He turned to look at her. "What about you? What brought you and your husband out here from Illinois?" Rose smiled faintly at the memory. James had grand ideas about building an empire in the West. He came from money, originally a Boston banking family. But he wanted to make his own way. She glanced toward the small, struggling homestead. This wasn't quite the empire he imagined. "But he had you," Preston said quietly. "Some would call that wealth enough." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Rose felt her cheeks warm and looked down at her hands. "He was a good man," she said finally. "He would have been a wonderful father." Preston nodded, respecting her grief. "It's getting late," he said, rising from his seat on the porch step. "I should head back before full dark." As had become their routine, Rose walked him to where his horse was tethered. This time, however, Preston hesitated before mounting. "I was thinking," he said, his voice carefully casual. There's a social at the Wilsons' place next Saturday. Folks from all around gathering for a barn raising and a dance afterward. He turned his hat in his hands. Perhaps you might like to attend? The community should know you're here, in case you ever need help. Rose hadn't considered socializing since James's death. The thought of facing strangers, of trying to explain her situation, was daunting. But Preston's reasoning made sense, and something in her longed for connection beyond her isolated homestead. I'm not sure, she hedged. Emma, Mrs. Wilson has 5 children of her own and welcomes little ones, Preston assured her, and it's only for an afternoon. I could come by with the wagon and bring you both home before nightfall. Rose hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, yes, I think that would be nice. The smile that broke across Preston's face was like sunshine after rain. Good. That's good. He mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Until Saturday then. As he rode away, Rose hugged herself against the cooling evening air. For the first time in months, she found herself looking forward to something beyond mere survival. Saturday dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect late spring day that made the harshness of frontier life seem worthwhile. Rose woke early, nervous energy propelling her through her chores at double speed. After feeding and changing Emma, she filled the washtub with water she'd heated on the stove and took her first proper bath in weeks. The question of what to wear plagued her as she rummaged through her meager wardrobe. She had exactly 2 dresses that weren't work clothes, her blue Sunday dress and the green one she'd worn when she and James were courting. Rose hadn't worn either since the funeral. After much deliberation, she chose the green dress. It was slightly faded but still presentable, and somehow wearing her funeral dress to a social seemed wrong, as if she were bringing grief to a celebration. The dress hung loose on her frame, a testament to the weight she'd lost since Emma's birth. Rose cinched the waist tighter with a belt and pinched color into her pale cheeks. Her blonde hair, once her pride, had thinned during pregnancy, but was starting to regain its luster thanks to Daisy's milk. She pinned it up in a simple but elegant style she remembered from happier days. Preston arrived precisely when he'd promised, just after midday. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his least worn pair of denims. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard. The sight of him looking so handsome made Rose momentarily forget her carefully rehearsed greeting. Mrs. Patterson, he said, removing his hat as she opened the door. Then his eyes took in her appearance, and he seemed similarly at a loss for words. You look very nice, he finally managed. Thank you, Rose replied, smoothing her dress nervously. So do you. Preston cleared his throat. The wagon's ready whenever you are. Rose nodded, retreating inside to gather Emma and the small bundle of supplies she'd need for the afternoon clean diapers, a blanket, and a bottle of Daisy's milk. When she emerged, Preston stepped forward to help her into the wagon, his hand strong and steady beneath her elbow. The brief contact sent a jolt of awareness through Rose that she immediately tried to dismiss. The Wilson farm was about 5 miles away, a journey that would have been impossible for Rose to make alone with an infant. As they traveled, Preston pointed out landmarks and shared what he knew about their neighbors. The Wilsons have been here 8 years, which makes them old-timers in these parts, he explained. John Wilson serves as the unofficial mayor, doctor, and judge for the area. His wife, Sarah, is the closest thing to a midwife we have. Good people. Rose nodded, taking in the information while anxiety built in her chest. Will there be many people attending? Maybe 20 families, spread across 30 miles or so, Preston replied. Not everyone will come, of course, but barn raisings usually draw a crowd. People crave the company. Rose understood that all too well. Despite her nervousness, Part of her was desperate for conversation beyond her one-sided talks with Emma and her increasingly frequent visits from Preston. They arrived to find the Wilson farm already bustling with activity. The barn raising was well underway, with men on ladders and scaffolding working together to erect the frame. Women had set up tables laden with food under a grove of cottonwood trees, while children of various ages darted about in games of tag and hide-and-seek. Preston helped Rose down from the wagon, his hands spanning her waist briefly. "Let me introduce you to Sarah Wilson first," he suggested. "She'll make sure you and Emma are comfortable." Rose nodded gratefully, clutching her daughter closer as they approached a robust woman with graying hair and a kind face who was directing younger women in the arrangement of dishes. "Sarah," Preston called, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Rose Patterson and her daughter, Emma. They've got a homestead about 5 miles east of my place." Sarah Wilson's welcoming smile put Rose at ease immediately. "Mrs. Patterson, we've been wondering who took up the old Simmons claim. And this little angel must be Emma." She wiped her hands on her apron and peered at the baby. "May I?" Rose hesitantly allowed Sarah to take Emma, who blinked up at the new face with curious blue eyes. "She's beautiful," Sarah pronounced. "And you, my dear, look like you could use some feeding up. Come, let me introduce you to everyone, and then we'll make sure you get a plate of food." With a reassuring nod from Preston, Rose allowed herself to be swept into the circle of women. To her surprise, they welcomed her warmly, asking questions about her homestead and offering advice about gardening and child-rearing in the territory. No one pressed her about her husband's absence, though Rose sensed they had already intuited her situation. Throughout the afternoon, Rose found herself repeatedly looking for Preston among the men working on the barn. She told herself it was natural to seek out the one familiar face in the crowd, but something deeper stirred when their eyes occasionally met across the distance. As the sun began its descent, the barn frame stood complete. The men, sweaty and satisfied with their work, joined the women for a hearty meal. Preston appeared at Rose's side, his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, a healthy flush on his face from the day's labor. "How are you finding it?" he asked as he accepted a plate of food from Sarah Wilson. "Everyone has been very kind," Rose replied honestly. "I didn't realize how much I missed people." Preston nodded in understanding. "The isolation can be the hardest part of frontier life. That's why these gatherings matter." After the meal, several men produced fiddles and harmonicas, and the younger children were put to bed in the Wilson house while the adults cleared space for dancing. "Would you care to dance, Rose?" Preston asked, offering his hand as the first tune began. Rose hesitated, glancing toward the house where Emma was sleeping under Sarah Wilson's watchful eye. "I haven't danced since before Emma was born," she admitted. "I'm not sure I remember how." Preston's smile was gentle. "It's like riding a horse. Your feet will remember." Against her better judgment, Rose placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her into the circle of dancers. The tune was a lively reel, and at first, Rose felt awkward and stiff, too conscious of the eyes upon them. But Preston was a capable leader, and soon she found herself caught up in the music and movement. By the third dance, Rose was laughing, her cheeks flushed with exertion and pleasure. When the fiddles switched to a slower waltz, Preston's hand settled at her waist, his touch respectful but warm through the fabric of her dress. "You dance beautifully," he said as they moved in perfect rhythm. "It's been a long time," Rose replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "James and I used to dance sometimes in the evenings." The memory brought a pang of both sweetness and sorrow. Preston's expression remained gentle. He was a fortunate man. Rose looked up, meeting his gaze directly. There was something in his eyes' admiration, certainly, but something more complex too, a longing that matched the ache building in her own heart. The moments stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Emma's cry cut through the music. Rose stepped back immediately, the spell broken. "I should check on her," she said, already moving toward the house. "Of course," Preston agreed, following a respectful distance behind. Emma had merely stirred briefly and settled again by the time they reached her, but the interruption had shifted the mood between them. As the evening drew to a close, Preston kept a polite distance, though his attentiveness never wavered. On the journey home, with Emma sleeping peacefully in Rose's arms, a comfortable silence settled between them. The prairie was bathed in silver moonlight, the vastness somehow less intimidating with Preston beside her. "Thank you for today," Rose said as they approached her cabin. "It was exactly what I needed." Preston smiled, the moonlight catching the angles of his face. "I'm glad. The territory can be harsh, but the people make it bearable." When they arrived, Preston insisted on seeing her safely inside, lighting the lamps and checking that all was secure before taking his leave. At the door he paused. "I'd like to call on you again, Rose," he said, his voice earnest in the lamplight. "Not just for practical matters or trades. If that would be agreeable to you." Rose felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. "I think I would like that," she answered truthfully. The smile that spread across Preston's face was worth any uncertainty she might feel. "Good night then, Rose Patterson." "Good night, Preston Grant." As she watched him drive away, Rose felt something unfurling inside her, something she had thought died with James. It was too soon to name it, too fragile to examine closely, but it warmed her like the first promise of spring after a long winter. Over the weeks that followed, Preston became a regular presence at the Patterson homestead. True to his word, he helped with the heavy work around the property while teaching Rose the skills she needed to maintain her independence. He showed her how to repair fence posts, how to predict weather from cloud patterns, and how to deal with the coyotes that occasionally threatened her chickens. In return, Rose's garden flourished under her attentive care, providing fresh vegetables that she shared with Preston. She taught him to appreciate the subtle flavors of her herbs, showed him how to preserve foods for the coming winter, and mended his clothes when they frayed. Their relationship evolved naturally, a partnership born of necessity but nurtured by growing affection. Preston never presumed or pushed, always careful to respect Rose's status as a recent widow. But his feelings were evident in the softening of his expression when she entered a room, in the gentleness of his hands when he passed Emma to her, in the lingering of his farewell each time he departed. For Rose, navigating her emotions proved more complex. Guilt plagued her, initially guilt for finding happiness in Preston's company when James was barely cold in his grave, guilt for looking forward to Preston's visits with an eagerness that sometimes frightened her. She wondered if she was betraying her husband's memory by allowing another man to become important to her so soon. But as summer ripened into early autumn, Rose came to understand that her heart, like her garden, was capable of new growth even after devastating loss. Her love for James remained, a permanent part of her, but it no longer consumed all the space within her. On a golden afternoon in late September, Preston arrived with a surprise, a rocking chair he'd crafted himself from oak and pine, perfectly sized for Rose's slight frame. "For those long nights with Emma," he explained as he set it before the fireplace. "And maybe for reading too, when you have the time." Rose ran her hands over the smooth wood, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Preston, it's beautiful. You made this yourself." He nodded, a hint of bashfulness in his smile. "My father was a carpenter before the war. He taught me a bit." Rose sat in the chair, testing its gentle motion. "It's perfect. Thank you." Preston watched her, his expression growing serious. "Rose, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Her heart quickened. "Yes. Winter will be here before we know it," he began, settling into the chair across from her. The first one is always the hardest in this territory. The blizzards can last for days, sometimes weeks. Travel becomes impossible. Rose nodded. She'd heard stories of the Dakota winters from other settlers at church services and socials she'd attended with Preston over the summer. I worry about you and Emma out here alone, Preston continued. If anything were to happen, illness, injury, or just running out of supplies, you'd have no way to call for help. What are you suggesting? Rose asked, though she suspected she knew where this conversation was heading. Preston leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I have a proposition. My cabin is sturdier than yours, built to withstand the worst of winter storms. It has 2 rooms now that I've added the extension. I believe it would be safer for you and Emma to winter there. With me. Rose's breath caught. Preston, as my wife, he finished quietly. If you do me that honor. The directness of his proposal shouldn't have surprised her. Preston had always been forthright, but Rose found herself momentarily speechless. I know it's sudden, Preston continued, his usually confident voice tinged with uncertainty. And I know you're still grieving James. I would never expect to replace him in your heart. But I care deeply for you, Rose, for both you and Emma. I believe we could build a good life together. Rose looked down at her hands, emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, the part that had come to depend on Preston's steady presence, that had grown to admire his integrity and kindness, that had begun to love him despite her initial resistance. But another part held back, afraid of moving too quickly, of making a decision based on practical considerations rather than true feeling. Preston, I don't know what to say, she finally admitted. I care for you 2 more than I thought possible after James. But marriage is. It's not something to enter lightly. Preston nodded, no disappointment visible in his expression. I understand, and I don't need an answer today. Think on it, pray about it if that's your way. I'll respect whatever decision you make. He rose from his chair, reaching for his hat. I should go. Let you have some peace to consider. Rose stood too, following him to the door. How long? She asked. How long have you felt this way? Preston turned to face her, his eyes solemn in the fading light. Since the day I saw you standing in your doorway with that shotgun, trying to protect your baby even though you could barely stand yourself. Your courage. It humbled me. The simple honesty of his answer touched Rose deeply. Before she could consider the propriety of her actions, she stretched up on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. I will think about it, she promised. Truly. Preston's hand came up to touch the spot where her lips had been, a look of wonder crossing his face. That's all I ask. After he left, Rose sat in her new rocking chair, Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. The question before her was momentous, a choice that would shape the rest of her life and her daughter's future. She thought of James, of the dreams they'd shared and the love they'd built. She thought of how he'd always wanted her happiness above all else, how he'd joked that if anything ever happened to him, she shouldn't mourn too long. Find someone who'll treat you right, he'd said once after a close call with a wild horse. Someone who'll love you like I do. At the time, she'd shushed him, unwilling to contemplate such a possibility. Now, those words seemed almost prophetic. As darkness fell, Rose made her decision. It came not from fear of the coming winter or practical necessity, but from the quiet certainty that had been growing in her heart all summer. Preston Grant was a good man, perhaps even the right man for this next chapter of her life. Emma stirred in her sleep, making the little snuffling sounds that always preceded waking. Rose lifted her daughter, cradling her close as she began to fuss. What do you think, little one? She whispered. Shall we make a new family with Mr. Grant? Emma blinked up at her mother, then gave a toothless smile that Rose chose to interpret as approval. 2 days later, when Preston returned as promised, Rose met him on the porch, her expression serene despite the nervous fluttering in her stomach. "I've thought about your proposal," she said without preamble. Preston removed his hat, his face carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed his hope. "And, before I give my answer, I need you to understand something." Rose took a deep breath. "I will always love James. He was my first love and he gave me Emma. That won't change." "I would never ask it to," Preston assured her. "Your love for him is part of who you are." Rose nodded, relieved by his understanding. "If I agree to marry you, it won't be just for protection or practicality. It will be because I've come to care for you deeply, because I believe we could build something genuine together." Preston stepped closer, hope blooming visibly in his expression. "Are you saying yes, Rose Patterson?" A smile spread across her face, surprising her with its fullness. "Yes, Preston Grant. I am saying yes." The joy that transformed his features was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Preston closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with exquisite tenderness. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In response, Rose lifted her face to his. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, sweet with the newness of their understanding. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of this trust," he vowed. "As will I," Rose replied softly. They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the area, a coincidence Rose viewed as divine blessing on their union. The ceremony was simple, attended only by the Wilsons as witnesses and a handful of neighbors who had come to mean so much to Rose over the previous months. Emma, dressed in a gown Rose had painstakingly fashioned from one of her own dresses, slept peacefully in Sarah Wilson's arms throughout the short service. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Rose with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. That evening, after moving Rose's and Emma's belongings to Preston's cabin, their cabin, now the new family sat before the fireplace. Emma cradled between them on the bearskin rug. "I have something for you," Preston said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a simple gold band, polished to a soft glow in the firelight. "It was my mother's. I've been saving it for this day, though I hardly dared hope it would come." Rose extended her trembling hand, allowing Preston to slide the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose but could be adjusted. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring how the gold caught the light. "Not as beautiful as its wearer," Preston replied, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her palm. Rose's heart swelled with emotion. The cabin, larger and sturdier than her own had been, already felt like home with Preston and Emma beside her. Through the window, she could see Daisy and her new companions grazing peacefully in the paddock Preston had built especially for them. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noticing her pensive expression. Rose smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about that day you rode up with Daisy. How desperate I was, how afraid for Emma. I never imagined that moment would lead to this." Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come from our darkest moments." "Yes," Rose agreed, watching as Emma's tiny fist curled around Preston's offered finger. "I believe they do." As winter descended upon the Dakota Territory, bringing with it howling blizzards and temperatures cold enough to freeze cattle in their tracks, Rose gave thanks daily for the sturdy walls of their cabin and the warmth of their hearth. More than that, she gave thanks for the man who shared her bed and her life, whose steady presence had become as essential to her as breathing. Preston proved to be a patient and tender husband, never rushing Rose's adjustment to their new intimacy, always attentive to her comfort and happiness. He took to fatherhood with natural ease, doting on Emma as if she were his own flesh and blood. Often, Rose would awaken in the night to find Preston already up, walking the floor with a fussing Emma so that Rose could sleep. Those long winter months, isolated from all but their closest neighbors by vast snowdrifts, solidified their bond in ways that might have taken years under different circumstances. They learned each other's habits and preferences, discovered shared interests and respectful ways to navigate differences. They established traditions, reading aloud by the fire in the evenings, Sunday dinners with special touches even when supplies ran low, quiet moments of reflection as they watched the stars through their frosted window. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it the birth of new calves to their growing herd and fresh green shoots in their expanded garden, Rose could scarcely remember what life had been like before Preston. Her grief for James had not disappeared but had transformed into a gentle remembrance that no longer dominated her days. Emma's first birthday arrived with the early summer, a milestone Rose had once feared they might not reach. They celebrated with a small gathering of neighbors, marveling at how the once fragile infant had grown into a robust toddler, with Preston's dark hair and Rose's blue eyes, a coincidence that many remarked upon with knowing smiles. "She looks just like your husband," Sarah Wilson commented as Emma took wobbly steps toward Preston, arms outstretched demandingly. "Yes," Rose agreed, her heart full as she watched Preston swing Emma into the air, eliciting peals of laughter. "She does at that." Later, when their guests had departed and Emma slept soundly in the cradle Preston had crafted for her, husband and wife sat together on their porch, watching the summer twilight deepen over their land. "I have news," Rose said, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Preston turned to her, his expression curious. "Good news, I hope?" Rose took his hand and placed it gently over her still flat stomach. "The best kind. If my calculations are correct, we'll welcome a new little Grant around Christmas time." The wonder that dawned on Preston's face was everything Rose had hoped for. "A baby?" he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. "Truly." Rose nodded, tears of joy gathering in her eyes. "Truly. Are you happy?" In answer, Preston gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words could not. When they finally parted, he pressed his hand once more to her abdomen, marveling at the miracle contained within. "I never thought I could be this fortunate," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "When I left Pennsylvania, I believed I was destined to make my way alone. Now I have you and Emma, and soon another little one." He shook his head in wonder. "It's more than I ever dared dream." Rose laid her head on his shoulder, contentment washing through her like a gentle tide. "It's funny, isn't it? How life works. If Emma hadn't been hungry that day, if you hadn't heard her crying, I would have found you anyway," Preston said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be." As night settled fully over the prairie, bringing with it a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch, Rose considered the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of desperation to the heights of joy, from the cry of a hungry child to the promise of new life, it was a path she could never have anticipated but would not trade for any other. "I love you, Preston Grant," she whispered into the darkness. His arm tightened around her, his lips finding her temple in a tender kiss. "And I love you, Rose Grant, until my last breath." Together they watched as a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the heavens, a fitting benediction for a love born of kindness, nurtured by respect, and destined to flourish under the vast Dakota sky for many years to come. On a crisp December morning, as the first light of dawn painted the snow-covered prairie in shades of pink and gold, Rose gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Preston paced outside their bedroom as Sarah Wilson attended the delivery, his face etched with concern at each of Rose's cries. When the baby's lusty wail finally pierced the air, Preston sagged against the wall in relief. Minutes later, Sarah opened the door, her face weary but beaming. "Congratulations, Mr. Grant. You have a fine son." Preston entered the bedroom to find Rose propped up against their pillows, her face pale but radiant as she cradled their newborn. Emma, now 18 months old, had been allowed to join her mother and was peering curiously at her new brother from her perch beside Rose on the bed. "He's perfect?" Preston whispered, sinking onto the edge of the bed and reaching out a tentative hand to stroke the baby's dark hair. "Just like his mother." Rose smiled tiredly. "I was thinking he looks more like his father." They named him James Preston Grant, a tribute to the past and a bridge to the future. Little JP, as they came to call him, thrived under the doting attention of his parents and the enthusiastic, if sometimes overzealous affection of his big sister. As the years passed, the Grant family and their ranch prospered. Preston's careful management and Rose's complementary skills created a successful operation that expanded steadily. They added a stone addition to their cabin, then eventually built a proper 2-story house with glass windows and a wide front porch where they gathered on summer evenings to watch their children play. Emma grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's determination and her stepfather's quiet strength. Though she knew Preston wasn't her biological father, Rose and Preston had decided early on to be honest about their family's origins. Emma considered him her true father in every way that mattered. The bond between them was unshakable, built on years of bedtime stories, patient writing lessons, and unwavering support. JP developed into a thoughtful boy with a natural affinity for animals and his father's talent for carpentry. 2 more children joined the family over the years, Sarah Rose in 1880 and Michael Thomas in 1883, completing their family circle. Through the inevitable hardships of frontier life, drought years that threatened their crops, harsh winters that claimed livestock, occasional illnesses that swept through the territory, Preston and Rose faced each challenge together, their partnership only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. On their 10th anniversary, Preston surprised Rose with a special gift, a locket containing tiny portraits of all 4 children, painted by an artist who had passed through the now thriving town that had grown up 15 miles from their ranch. "To remind you of the fruits of our love," he said as he fastened it around her neck. Rose touched the locket reverently, then looked up at the man who had become the center of her world. At 36, Preston's hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and lines of experience framed his eyes and mouth. To Rose, he had never been more handsome. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving a package wrapped in brown paper from her dresser drawer. "Though it's not nearly so fine as your gift." Preston unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Rose's neat handwriting. "What's this?" he asked, turning it carefully in his hands. "Our story," Rose explained. "I started writing it last winter, how we met, how you brought Daisy to save Emma, how we fell in love. I thought perhaps someday our children and grandchildren might want to know how it all began." Preston opened the journal, reading the first lines aloud. "Her child cried for milk she didn't have. The cowboy brought a cow from his herd. And so began the greatest love story of my life." His voice broke on the final words. When he looked up, his eyes shone with emotion. "This is the most precious gift I've ever received." Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Preston traced gentle patterns on Rose's shoulder, his touch still sending shivers through her after all their years together. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "what would have happened if I hadn't heard Emma crying that day? If I'd taken a different trail or passed by just an hour earlier or later?" Rose turned in his arms to face him, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "Sometimes. But then I remember what you told me on the night we learned about JP, that you would have found me anyway. That some things are meant to be." Preston pressed a kiss to her palm. "I still believe that." "As do I," Rose whispered, settling deeper into his embrace. "As do I." Outside their window, The stars shone down on the prosperous ranch that had grown from desperate beginnings, the large barn housing Daisy's descendants and the expanded herd, the bunkhouse where 2 ranch hands now lived to help with the increasing workload, the chicken coop and vegetable gardens that provided abundantly for their table, the small schoolhouse Preston had built when the children reached learning age. All of it had begun with a cow and an act of kindness, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, compassion could take root and flourish into something beautiful and enduring. As Rose drifted toward sleep in the arms of the man who had saved her in more ways than one, she gave thanks for the journey that had brought them here, not despite its hardships but because of them. For it was in the darkest moment of her life that she had found the light that would guide her home. And what a beautiful home it was!